So, where do psychoanalytic fairy tale interpretations come from anyway? About a week ago, I did one on the fairy tale known as Rumpelstiltskin. And what I said in that video about that fairy tale was essentially as follows. I said that complexes form in the face of trauma. They split off from the ego as ego independent attempts at adaptation. They can work offline from the ego to preserve precious conscious ego resources. They initially serve adaptation and protection, but like the immune system, which also acts unconsciously, they can go on too long, kind of like chronic inflammation. And the long story short is that the fairy tale actually shows you the dynamics of this particular complex in the case of unrealistic expectations, perfectionism being placed on someone. That's something that's probably been encountered throughout the history of humanity. So, what I was essentially saying is that the folk tale has basically given us a really interesting and image heavy snapshot of how this particular dynamic works with this particular experience and complex formation. It also gives us the answer to it. So, okay, given all of that, this would be a classic psychoanalytic interpretation of a folktale with my own particular spin on it. But of course, there's other scholars and individuals who've come up with these ways of interpreting fairy tales while still giving them their own particular spin. Consider, for example, that fairy tales and the Rumpelstiltskin fairy tale in particular have been explored over the years, not just by Jung himself, but by Marie-Louise von Franz, James Hillman, Lionel Corbett, Murray Stein, William Randall, James Hollis, Lisa Kahn, Elizabeth Nugent, Kaylin, Narrow-Jody, Wayner, Joshua Baer, Oliver Teal, Zet Harbor. You get the idea. Okay. There's also a bunch of podcasts all over the internet that cover this very subject. So, what happens if I come across one of these interpretations that seems rather similar to mine? Well, then what? Should I be offended? Should I claim or imply that they stole my ideas without credit? Well, let's examine that. Let's take a look at a couple of the things that I brought up in mine. The psyche acts like the immune system, for example. Now, this is something I've been saying for years, noticing how defenses behave and act like rapid inflammatory responses that can go on for too long versus memory responses that target specific problems. That's something that you see the immune system doing. Now, this is not a particularly unique idea. I think it's a rather straightforward general observation. I would simply say, yes, you see it too, don't you? Isn't that fascinating? What about some of the other observations? Characters in fairy tales are depictions of commonly found complexes, for example. Well, this idea goes all the way back to Jung, but it was really elaborated on in great depth by Marie-Louise von Franz. The idea of complexes actually go back to Pierre Janet. Janet is cited extensively in Gestalt psychology and is acknowledged in self-psychology as well as Jung. I have encountered some folks who have said that Janet was ignored, but that's just false. Fairy tales depict typical traumas and their solutions, right? That's another one. Again, von Franz leads the way here. There's lots of ways to elaborate on this, each one unique and interesting, but it's not really groundbreaking to the point of needing to be cited if someone comes up with a variation on this idea. What about some of the other things that I mentioned in that particular video? The dark forest, for example, a metaphor for going beyond ego consciousness. Again, Jung, von Franz, countless others have observed this in the tradition of Jungian analytic interpretations of folk tales. Okay, what about the non-ego consciousness is still conscious? That's something that I've mentioned several times. Well, Jung, again, leads the way here. But you can also see this in affective neuroscience and consciousness studies and in the work of Anthony Stevens, which I'll get to a little bit later. What about the solution in Rumpelstiltskin of naming the complex as being the solution, at least partially, to overcoming and navigating that complex and resolving that complex? Well, this is essentially another element of cross-cultural analysis. In other words, The idea of naming things is not just important in Jungian analysis, but you see this in cross-cultural rituals. The importance of naming things as making them real, for example. Many cultures, you're not even a real person until you're given a name, and that doesn't happen right after birth necessarily. Things are not real until they are socially real for Homo sapiens. Our world is a social world. Our environment is an intensely social environment. And naming and language are absolutely critical to that. So the naming of a complex as being part of the solution to it, going out into the dark forest, quote unquote, and finding the name of the thing that's plaguing you, that's not a unique idea to really anybody. That's something that you will find in cross-cultural ritual studies, in Jungian analysis, and all kinds of psychoanalysis, really, so forth and so on. Okay. What about the idea of the biopsychosocial model and the biopsychosocial approach to this? Well, again, that's not particularly unique to anything at this point. In medical school and in residency, we had to literally write all of our notes with the biopsychosocial model intact. George Engel's model was itself a repackaging of psychiatrist Roy Grinker's 1952 psychosomatic social model. Grinker was trained and analyzed by Freud himself. So there's a long history of this. So then you might say, okay, Dr. G, what's so unique about your approach then? Well, if you notice the interpretations offered up at this point, many times are just simply assertions based on clinical work and the tradition of foundational principles in this type of work. So what about those principles? Isn't there anything outside of psychoanalytic theory that supports, say, archetypal narratives, complexes, fairy tale analysis, or do you just kind of have to take it on faith and say, well, it's based on clinical experience? So these questions, again, are not mine. These are questions that several Jungians of the last century started really asking, particularly in the decades following Jung's death. Anthony Stevens is one of the big pioneers here. But you can also see this in the scholarly work of George Hoganson, Maxim McDowell, Gene Knox, Saunders and Scarr, Alan Maloney, John Whewell, many, many others. All of these scholars have been published in peer-reviewed journals, and they've been fielding this particular questions in various ways with various results. What I mean is they were asking the question of, is there a way to verify this outside of the hermeneutic tradition of psychoanalysis, or do we just kind of have to take it on faith? And many of them came with different answers to that. Now, Anthony Stevens said, yes, you can look at evolutionary science and you can look at genetics and bioscience and say the results from these fields independently back up, broadly speaking, the Jungian ideas that he was very familiar with and was discussing. So what is unique to my own scholarly work is that I take this same question that these other scholars started, and I've taken it into areas not yet encountered or to a higher level of detail than previously explored. I've taken it into fields such as folkloristics, using the ATU typing method for folktales. I'm not seeing that in a whole lot of scholarly work, and yet it's very applicable, looking at collections of folktales around the world that have done by experts in folklore. What affective neuroscientists, evolutionary psychology, psychogenomics, code biology, philosophy of mind. I've drawn a lot of my inspiration from Anthony Stevens and went into these other realms to continue the questions he started. Over the years, in fact, Stevens and I corresponded, and he guided me in my early papers until eventually he just said, I'm just reading these for enjoyment and I'm cheering you on. In fact, let me share with you his last email to me. Now, I didn't know this was his last email to me, but it was. Not long after this email, he passed away. And he had this to say about a paper that I had recently sent him. He said, quote, I'm filled with admiration for your analysis of genome and environment interaction. I think it's a masterpiece of concise exegesis which carries the whole matter into an inadequately examined plane. I absolutely agree with you that others have seriously underestimated the genome's capacities. It is immensely reassuring to know that one is not forgotten and that the cause one espoused all those years ago is being shaped and developed by such eminently capable hands as your own. He emailed that to me on October 13th, 2022. I mean, how could you not love that? I mean, I feel like it's an incredible privilege to hear this from someone of such brilliance and stature, allowing me to stand on the shoulders of such giants to see as far as I can. It's very humbling and inspiring. So, since I started writing in 2010, I've published 38 articles, books and book chapters in 10 different peer-reviewed journals and academic presses. Others have published way more than that, of course, and I'm always eager to learn from them. In that growing body of work, the main thing I bring is to take very seriously these questions of why should we accept these interpretations? Is there anything that tells us that they are true? Why should we believe a Jungian psychoanalytic interpretation of anything? Is there some independent way of verifying these proposed principles using modern biosciences? Now, if you read my work, you'll know the answer to that is yes, there are a lot of things that independently verify it. And in fact, not only can we verify it, we can update it, because these different fields of study that I bring and integrate with Jungian theory are informative, verifying in a broad sense, but also they give us a whole lot of new, interesting information to work with to further develop and push the theory further. What I've found really is that psychoanalytic, particularly contemporary Jungian thought surrounding folktales, is not only accurate, but it's supported by various kinds of disciplines, which makes for an excellent reason to take such things seriously, or even include such elements in your own fictional works if you're a fiction writer, such as myself. As I've mentioned, I have done this for King of the Forgotten Darkness, which is available now for pre-order, link below. But I've also used this knowledge of folk tales and the usefulness and the truth that you can find in these interpretations in clinical work and in personal development. In any case, if you enjoyed this, click the like, sub, sign up for my newsletter as well. There's some podcasts and stuff on there you can't get here on the Imaginarium YouTube channel. And until then, I'll see you next time.